You're listening to A Neighbor's Choice Radio. In this episode, I'll be talking with Dr. Ron Paul, the former congressman from Texas who spent his entire life advocating a society of nonviolence, non-aggression, and respect for each other's dignity of life. Enjoy. I tend to focus on the church, particularly my goal with this project that I've started in my writings and the podcast is to introduce the teachings of Jesus, especially his nonviolence message, to the church and the broader public. So my focus is, 2,000 years after Jesus said, "Do not resist evil with violence." And then, of course, he was scapegoated by his community, the governing authorities and the religious authorities of his town, and he was crucified on the cross. And in that time, he said, "Forgive them, Father, for they don't know what they're doing." And so my question for you is, 2,000 years later, do we know what we're doing with the things that we participate with the state?
Well, you'd hope people would know. I think instinctively most people do know, but they're also they also get a lot of information from their environment, current religious teachings and what they get in their schools and what happens, and sometimes it gets neutralized. I've always argued that most people are born with a very libertarian instinct for peace and prosperity and not war, but then the influence of the culture and the society and even the false information we get from our religious leaders sometimes is that you accept this. I was a bit annoyed during the presidential campaigns where if I would talk to an evangelical Christian audience, they didn't like me to talk about the Prince of Peace and that we treat people as if the way we would want to be treated, and that was very unacceptable for some of the church audience and Christian audiences. Yet I think they're pretty good suggestions. Now, I think that people, are the same as they were for a long time. I think that we still don't quite have it figured out because the wars have been going on for a long time. But in my little booklet that I did, Swords into Plowshares, I try to make the case that, we're not locked in on this type of a society. I mean, it's different now than it was 2,000, 3,000 years ago.
That's true.
We have different understanding, so I keep hoping that it can change, but I guess the answer to your question is we're not there yet, but it's worth working for.
Right. I'm influenced by the work of a late French anthropologist named René Girard, and he talks a lot about violence and where does violence come from. And one of the things that struck me about his work, he identified the state as a vestige of sacrificial religion, that it actually evolved as humans developed culture through thousands and thousands of years. They found a way of preventing supposed chaos with a little dose of sacrifice, blaming a common enemy, whether it was the witch doctor or the enemy tribe or some victim. Sometimes it was the king, if the king had worn out his welcome in the tribe, and they would scapegoat that victim, and by doing that, the community could find peace and order and a sense of transcendence. And so Girard says that the state is kind of an anthropological holdover from that religious practice. Do you see the state in that way as a kind of religious enterprise?
Yeah, absolutely, because, the ultimate state, the leader becomes a god. All we have to do is look at North Korea, and there's always those trends. They might not be that blunt about the leader becoming God, but the state becomes the God. I think there's a natural tendency that's been with the human race for a long, long time, even before Christ, and that was to have religious convictions and believe in certain things, that believe in the Ten Commandments and this sort of thing. But it is something that has been with us for a long time. But right now, I think that what tends to happen is when you defer to the state to do some of the things that religion ought to do, some people who want to solidify their power, make use of religion. Mm-hmm. And that's what happens, even in our country, when they need support for war and some of the things, the use of violence, they don't call the state their God, but the state uses, religion. But
right.
that happens in all the religions, whether it's the Muslim religion, Christian religion. Mm-hmm. It's been known throughout history. That's why the job of theologians and believers is to sort this all out, right. and see if we can figure out the difference between the spiritual life and this political life that uses religion right. to try to justify what they're doing.
And regardless of what popular religion it uses, whatever the case it is, the state has rituals. It has words like sacred office of the presidency. That's one of the reasons why I think Trump is causing trouble, is because he uses kind of vulgar language and rough language, and he's kind of direct with his love for power. It ruins the people who really love the state religion. It ruins the sanctity of the executive office, because it's almost as if you're not supposed to be so blunt and open about the vulgarity of the state. It seems like Trump in some way is being an accidental blessing for the cause of liberty, because his flagrant language is kind of revealing and unmasking the state's sacred violence, so to speak.
Yeah, we have a lot of talk these days about fake news. That's really not brand new, but it's out in the open now. But false gods have been around for a long time, right. And it's not always easy to figure this out for the average person. That's right. why leaders are supposed to help on this rather than playing with it right. and making use of it. This need for something to believe in. If they use that to promote violence, then it becomes a monster, and that's been done throughout the centuries. And that's why I think Christianity is so different. Right. It was meant to be the opposite. It meant to be talking about our spiritual life and how we do it. And of course, Christianity fits well into my political thinking too of nonviolence. They tend to they blend together. Right. And there have been a lot of the libertarian writers that even might not be profess Christianity recognize that Christ did usher in a certain age where the individual became pretty important right. in assuming responsibility for oneself. And I keep telling people, if we have the obligation to assume responsibility for our eternity, why shouldn't we be allowed to make our decision on how we're going to spend the money we earn? We have a tremendous amount of responsibility in the theological sense, but that for some reason, oh no, you don't need that. We're going to have to tell you what you can read and write, and how you're going to spend your money, and where you're going to work, and how you can travel, and all these other things. And yet, I think Christianity teaches a lot of libertarian thoughts about responsibility.
Right, and when you mention nonviolence, just to kind of lay the foundation with that, you would say, is it correct to say that there is no moral reason to ever initiate an act of aggression against anybody who has not threatened to physically harm you or steal something from you?
Yeah, I think the key word in what you just said was initiate. We can't initiate the force. but you don't have to be a total pacifist to be a libertarian.
Right.
We might not laugh at the pacifists, but I certainly don't take a position that you don't have the right to defend your family if somebody comes busting in your house and beating up on your kids. I don't think that. It's the initiation of force which is the key.
Right, and self-defense, like you just mentioned, would be different from, say, vengeance, right? I don't think in a Christian world vengeance is ever. I mean, I guess this is something beyond just the state, but vengeance is something that I think a lot of Christians feel like they have an entitlement to.
Yeah, but what they don't understand is vengeance is destructive not because they're doing something that maybe the person deserves some punishment. Vengeance is dangerous because of what it does to the individual. See, I'm opposed to the death penalty not because the person doesn't deserve it, because they're monsters, right, and we should be protected. But I think it's what it does to the individual. That's why I think that if the individual that wants the vengeance, why should it become sterile? Why shouldn't it be that individuals that go there and participates in it? Oh no, that wouldn't be very nice. If I have to watch it and see it.
Exactly.
But vengeance, vengeance is something that hurts the individuals that's participating in. It doesn't do anything to correct or keep us safe from the people who are violent.
That's what's interesting when the story with Jesus with the adulterous woman, he says, who's going to cast the first stone? And what's happening is he's almost, I call that the first act of deconstructing collectivism in history, because what he's saying to the crowd, they're whipped up into a fervor. Together as a group, they can hide their violence, right? Because if you're in a crowd of, say, 50 people, it's very easy to say, well, I was the 49th stone that hit the adulterous woman. I don't know if I actually killed her. I think she was already dead. We have this way of letting the crowd possess us. And what Jesus does in that illustration is he says, who's going to cast the first stone? And all of a sudden they have to take personal responsibility for each rock in their hand, and suddenly they do a reverse crowd phenomenon. They all drop their rocks in tandem in consequence. So it's an interesting illustration for what you just said, is that vengeance, especially when we do it as a collective group, we don't see the violence that we're doing. We shield our eyes from it.
And that is why war is so bad, because people can become divorced from what is really happening and say, well, I've just been convinced that the Chinese are very, very bad people, and we have to do this and that. Even though it might be done for financial reasons to benefit some companies, people can be convinced. A better example probably would be Saddam Hussein. I mean, he was killing people, he was mean and nasty, and therefore, they pump up a lot of lies, and the people feel very good. We got to kill that guy. He is a monster. And it turns out, well, that didn't solve the problem. It made the problems worse, and it was vengeance against a false enemy, not a perfect individual, obviously, but against an individual that wasn't really exactly what they portrayed him to be. But all wars are like that. War propaganda. They do it all the time. They have to get the people, energized for this. I think there was even some of that to motivate our own civil war.
What do you think? So, just to clarify, do you think that voting then is an act of violence, in the sense that not all voting, but if you know that there's a candidate who's promising wars of aggression, he's promising to keep drug offenders and sex workers and raw milk sellers and all these nonviolent people confined to a human cage under his watch, under his purview, and you vote for that person, you hire that person to represent you, are you committing an act of violence against your neighbor?
Well, to me, it wouldn't be exactly like if you picked up your gun and went and robbed somebody and then shot them. That's much more vicious. And I think the people who promote the foreign policy, and too often people vote for these individuals because it's the lesser of two evils, So, but I think that's up for negotiation, in the sense where when I wouldn't vote for anybody that I thought was, very likely to start a war. And matter of fact, the American people are generally that way. I always argue that the peace candidate generally does better than the war candidate. And right now we have an example. Trump, sort of stuck his neck out and says, why can't I talk to Russia? Anybody who wants to have a war with Russia, that's dumb. So he knew and understood that as well, even with his other shortcomings. But I wouldn't want to put the litmus test up there and it would be a little more judgmental than I would try to teach people, politically. Don't do this. This is you're participating in something, but I don't think I'd put it in the same category if you went out and picked a fight yourself personally.
Right. And the same would go for jury members then. If they're trying a person for a drug offense, they're not acting in a violent way if they render a guilty verdict, even though it's a nonviolent act. You would extend that same.
Well, I don't know. I'd be pretty picky about that. Because I believe that the ultimate resistance to a totalitarian state in our country should be the jury nullification. So if I were on the jury. I would never succumb to that. I'm not so sure that somebody else who doesn't understand jury nullification and he's been sort of brainwashed into believing that he's doing something good. I don't want to get into this category of being overly judgmental on that particular issue. But I'll tell you what, that's a challenge, and as a matter of fact, that's one of my favorite issues, and that is jury nullification. And we're starting to get state nullification of drug laws, which I think is perfect. That states have been resisting the federal government. That's why I'm disappointed with Trump and Sessions, because it looks like they're going to go back on that.
Right. Well, and then so I do appreciate your time, and we're going to wrap it up here. But for one final question is, how would you address your fellow Christians in the audience? There's 70% of Americans. I know you have a message that's consistent across the board, but particularly with Christians, they identify with Jesus and his life and the way he taught, his ethics. And so I'm just asking you as a Christian, what would you say to your Christian neighbor in a nutshell, why they should look at the nonviolence of Christ and application to our affairs today and society?
Well, I think like everything else, it's information and being well informed, and a Christian or somebody moving in that direction, they should be very prayerful, because I think they can be enlightened. But everybody's going to come to this in different fashions. Some of us, have been raised in a Christian home, and it's not quite as dramatic. But if you're talking to people, I think it's information and reading and studying the people that you respect. And there are a lot of Christian writers, and I think they help you move in a particular direction. In economics, I was so delighted when I discovered that somebody had economic understanding similar to mine. I thought I was the only one, so I was delighted to discover the Austrian school. I think that's the way it could be in faith too, because if you have an instinct, if you're not a Christian, but you have an instinct, and you discover what Jesus taught, then you think, oh yeah, that's supportive. I had one friend one time he was a good friend, and we would sort of debate religion, because he called himself a avowed atheist, but he was amazed that he really didn't know about it, because when he heard the interpretation of the parable of the talents, he thought, well, that doesn't sound too bad. Yeah, because if they're a libertarian and a so-called atheist, I think they're more open to it. But I think there's a lot of bad information that they get. They read into it, well, Jesus wasn't really a man of peace. He was just a hacky for the Roman government. Those stories are out there too. So they have to find the information that they respect somebody and at least honestly ask the right questions.
Well, I do thank you for your time, and I appreciate our conversation and enjoyed it.
Okay, very good.
Thank you.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye. Thank you.